China. Homage to a hero. 700 million Chinese know his name. They call him Brittain, the White One sent. He was a Canadian.
Everyone who knew Beth, whether they approve of him or don't approve of him, have to admit that it was like some meteor passing.
In another century, he might have been a crusader or troubadour or even a corsair.
As often as he saw an inflated balloon, he punctured it.
Well, he wasn't a person. It was just a chapel, a university. I don't know what it is, temple.
I don't know about his impact on Canada. I know about his impact on me. He changed my life. I think the impact is going to come as Canada begins to realize that they harbored and nourished one of the great saints of our century.
He gave all he had and all he could give to the cause of the betterment of the people of the world.
We have an hour to tell the story of this man. He was probably a great man. He was certainly one of the most difficult, fascinating, damnable, and beloved of Canadians. Oddly enough, he is largely unknown to his countrymen. And yet, as a lung surgeon and medical revolutionary in the Montreal of the 1930s, he took a sick society and shook it to its foundations. In the Spanish Civil War, he made what many people think was the greatest single contribution to military medicine. He went on to China, then at war with Japan, and from nothing built a medical structure that transformed him from a man into a legend. His name was Bethune.
My father was an evangelist, and I come of a race of men violent, unstable, of passionate convictions and wrong-headedness, intolerant, yet with it all a vision of truth and a drive to carry them on, even though it leads to their own destruction.
Norman Bethune was born in the small Ontario town of Gravenhurst in the year 1890. As the son of a Protestant preacher, he is constantly reminded that there is a hell that goes with heaven. He takes work in a northern bush camp to help pay for a college education. Then Toronto and medical school. It is 1914. 6 days after the outbreak of war, Bethune becomes a stretcher bearer. He goes overseas, is wounded, and comes home. He returns to university and graduates, a doctor. In Toronto, the war is remote. But one day a woman stops Bethune in the street and pins on his lapel the white feather of cowardice. He joins the Royal Navy as a surgeon and finishes out the war at sea. 1920, Bethune goes to England to continue medical studies at the London Children's Hospital in Great Ormond Street. A senior doctor calls him slapdash, refreshing, very unorthodox, even for a Canadian. A fellow intern is Dr. Graham Ross.
He loved an argument. He liked to, I think, upset certain people. One felt that he had no worries, that the world was his oyster, so to speak, and that he was there to get it. He worked hard, as I remember, in the hospital, and he played hard.
Buying and selling antiques to pay for the gay life, Bethune pauses to fall in love with and marry a Scottish beauty, Frances Penny.
We were married August 13th, and I broke my hand mirror that morning. Unlucky? He told me, "Now I can make your life a misery, but I'll never bore you. It's a promise." A promise kept.
They begin with a long European honeymoon.
The impact of all this on Beth was tremendous. He was Byronic then, pseudo-romantic, And hell, did he kick while his skin was shedding.
(1926). Bethune has tuberculosis. He had come to Detroit 2 years before and had built a solid medical practice. Now he is taken off to Trudeau Sanatorium at Saranac Lake in upstate New York. Thinking he is about to die, he decides to give his wife her freedom, and they are divorced. At 36 years of age, all seems ended.
Here, where we are excluded from the living world, we perhaps get a little closer to reality sometimes. Out of that closeness comes glimmerings of understanding with its inevitable cycle of despair, hope, resignation. But it comes too late for me.
At Saranac, Bethune is transformed. To the superficial brilliance is now added a heightened awareness, a sense of destiny. His enormous energies are becoming channeled.
In a dark moment in 1927, I dramatized in a series of allegorical drawings the story of my life. They ran for 60 feet around the walls of our cottage.
In the murals called A TB's Progress, Bethune caricatures man's endless, helpless battle against the diseases that beset him. The drawings are accompanied by bits of doggerel verse.
Sweet death, thou kindest angel of them all, in thy soft arms at last, oh, let me fall. Bright stars are out, long gone the burning sun. My little act is over, and the tiresome play is done.
Bethune's sense of fun never leaves him. He predicts his date of death and decides to go out laughing. There follow mad, irreverent days and nights. Parties with nurses, neighbors, and fellow patients, and all this despite the fact that not only are they in the midst of a TB sanatorium, they are in the midst of prohibition.
He considered himself a judge of the bootleg whiskey that might be brought to us. He considered that it was not a fit whiskey unless it could be drunk like milk. And he prided himself that he remembered the taste of both good whiskey and milk.
Rest and more rest is the prescribed cure of the day. Bethune is out of patience. He calls for the then dangerous pneumothorax operation. His lung is accidentally punctured. He almost dies, but then recovery is swift. Montreal in 1929. Norman Bethune comes to town.
It is only the dull and unimaginative who can lie in bed in a sanatorium for 6 months or a year and fail to rise a better and finer person. Life should be enriched and not impoverished by this retreat from the world, deepening the intellectual and spiritual life. The unimportant becomes the important, and the formerly essential becomes the superfluous.
He is taken on at the Royal Victoria Hospital and begins work under the famed surgeon Edward Archibald. Another young doctor is Wilder Penfield.
He was a very energetic surgeon, a very enthusiastic person, a man who was very loyal to Archibald, as I was, but who had his strong desires and enthusiasms in surgery and in life.
Bethune specializes in lung surgery and is soon widely known for his impatience with outworn tradition and practice. Here, in a rare piece of film, we actually see Bethune at work.
Bound by the rigid and inexorable laws of his medium, the human body, the surgeon is permitted but a few of the liberties his fellow craftsmen may take who work with stone, wood, or metal. But for all that, our craftsmen, often has the soul of a creative artist.
As a surgeon, he was distinguished for his speed and, above all else, I think, for his inventive capacity, which really, in a way, revolutionized the technical part of chest surgery.
Whatever he was doing, you always had to be prepared for a scene of some sort or another. If it wasn't the needles, it would be the machine, or it would be the sheet, or it would be dust on the floor, or it would be a pillow, or it would be you. He would make a scene.
If a knife was not cutting, so you throw it on the floor. If somebody, a nurse, was in his way, so he'd go like this, and he'll hit her in the belly. But it was not always like that.
If you stood up and fought with Dr. Bethune, he thought far more of you than if you didn't stand up and fight with him. And when I say fight, I mean fight. It was really shouting at each other at the end of the ward.
On our visits to the Royal Victoria, you literally stumbled over discarded instruments which Bethune had designed, but became impatient with them and had to design anew.
New instruments bearing the name of Bethune are soon being patented and sold to surgeons across the continent. Bethune is called to the Hollywood bedside of the motion picture queen Renée Adorée. She requires throat surgery. A few beads are lifted from a necklace. Bethune makes a mark on the throat, removes the necklace, performs the operation, and is able to assure the patient that a necklace will forever hide the scar.
Strange to say, this seems to fill the female breast with the most profound gratitude.
The results are published, and this is just one of many articles. Bethune is pouring his prodigious energies into provocative writings in medical journals and frank speeches to international medical societies. He is constantly questioning dogma, technique, creeds, conventions. He moves to Sacred Heart Hospital. The event is celebrated by a friend's painting and by Bethune himself.
10 miles from Montreal, French-Canadian and Catholic. $1,200 a year, 1 day a week, so the strain is less strained. I cauterized some adhesions there yesterday, and the chorus of ohs and ahs from the nuns rose like a chant at the high altar. My title is Chef dans les services de chirurgie pulmonaire et de bronchoscopie. I'm going to have a nice big white cap made with chef marked in front. Really, I'm delighted.
His disciple here is Dr. Georges Dehaye.
After the operation, he used to go and see the patients more often than he was supposed to. At that time, I was driving him. I took him to the hospital at 11 o'clock at night several times to see a patient. He was a little bit worried about that patient, so he used to go and see them before he goes to sleep.
When he was at work, Dr. Bethune was at work. If he wasn't at work, as you probably all know, he played just as hard. You didn't know that Dr. Bethune played very hard? Oh, dear me, yes, he had a wonderful time.
Don't think I ever knew anyone who attracted women to him more like a magnet than he did. One brilliant woman I recall, and a very beautiful woman she was too, when asked on one occasion had she ever met Bethune, said, "I saw him but once, and he was the most aggressively male creature I have ever encountered."
I love myself beautiful things, but I don't like exaggerate things. But I felt that he was a little loud in his clothes, but I say, but love for luxury. And often in his clothing and his love of perfumes and whatnot, it's sort of a vanity, female almost sort of quality of his character. He said, I love beautiful clothes. He brought from Montreal all his wonderful shirts embroidered by his sisters somewhere in the monastery. And
he had a lot of sensitivities. He thought he could smell a redhead, for instance, you see. He's a very curious fellow that way. Very, very sensitive.
Often he would, I think, seem to people to be almost anxious to shock, which would be partly, I think, a kind of suffocated feeling he had that our society was so routine, so regimented, and that we didn't really even realize what we were ourselves.
Norman Bethune, you know, could object to authority and at the same time be authoritarian. He objected to pomposity, and yet he could be pompous and aristocratic himself.
He was an aristocrat, I think, by nature. He was proud of his, what he called his aristocratic lineage. He was fond of talking about the Bethunes of France, who date back to William the Conqueror and before.
He was an extrovert, and he showed it in the choice of his ties. I think in the way he cropped his little mustache. Everything about Bethune was an expression of this jaunty extrovert that fundamentally he was.
In his $42 a month apartment, strong drink, good talk, outrageous pranks, savage assaults on the established order. The bright young men and beautiful women of Montreal are drawn to the man in the pork pie hat.
An amusing thing in the apartment was that the bathroom was painted a very bright yellow, and in the back of the toilet were 4 tins of primary color paints, red, yellow, blue, and green. And people whom he liked, and you felt very special if he said to you, you can use one of the cans of paint. And what you did was you put your hand in and then put your hand up on the wall over the John, and where the palm left a space, you wrote your name, Irene or George or whoever it was. And so the whole back of this thing was a series of different shaped hands, which were very gay and nice, and it was very personal and fun.
After his recovery from TB, he and Frances Penny had remarried, but the two personalities proved too strong for each other, and they were again divorced.
I was with Bethune when he received a wire from Frances saying that she had obtained the divorce. He emptied his glass, went to the nearest Western Union telegraph station, and wired Frances his congratulations and his proposal for another marriage.
However, they never remarried again.
Very clear and cold today. Sun shimmering on the snow and the sparrows making a great racket outside my windows. I wish you were here. I'm glad you're relatively happy and well. At least more than when you lived with my petulant irritability. God bless you. Beth.
There were no children, and it was a tragedy for them both.
Did you hear we had a doll child called Alice? She spent 6 months with her father and 6 months with her mother, like all good children of divorces.
To fill a void in his life, Bethune turns his apartment into a free art school for children.
Dr. Bethune was usually there at the classes, which were every Saturday morning, and he was there. He didn't mix into the teaching or anything, but he used to just talk to us and always served something for us to eat, you know, like milk and cookies. I don't know, I always got that impression about him, that he was rather shy. He certainly liked children, without being very ostentatious about it. He was just wonderful to us.
Bethune was a painter, throwing himself into this with characteristic enthusiasm and facility. The professional artist, Marion Scott, speaks of his talent.
I'm sure he had the qualities to be a painter. Perhaps the only quality he may have lacked was patience. I don't know, for being a painter, but he was so active in so many directions that he could only give us such a small time to his painting, and they were amazingly kind of free and intense.
An artist lets himself go. He enters eagerly into the life of man, of all men. He becomes all men in himself. The function of the artist is to disturb. His duty is to arouse the sleeper, to shake the complacent pillars of the world. He reminds the world of its dark ancestry, shows the world its present, and points the way to its new birth. He makes uneasy the static, the set, and the still.
It is 1935. The complacent pillars of the world are toppling.
Well, I think the Depression and Bethune sort of happened together. in August 1933, if my memory serves me right, Montreal's population was about 900,000, and about 225,000 men, women, and children were on direct relief. I was then secretary of the YMCA in Verdun. Beth dropped down to the Y quite frequently, and in the course of one of his visits, he said to me, "George," he said, "how would you like if I came down here and had a sick parade once a week?" And out of it developed Beth, Dr. Bethune's sick parade. And on Saturday between 12 and 1, Dr. Bethune came down, and using my office as his office, anybody who had a toothache or an earache or a suspected tummy ache went through and got Dr. Bethune's examination.
Dr. Trudeau well said, there is a rich man's tuberculosis and a poor man's tuberculosis. The rich man recovers, the poor man dies. This succinctly expresses the close embrace of economics and pathology.
The effect of the Depression on Bethune was to make an angry young man, he was still relatively a young man, much angrier.
He did believe in socialized medicine. He did believe that it was nobody who was poor could afford to be sick.
He was for action if it required political action, yes. If it required some form of social group action, yes. Whatever the action, let's take action.
With the young intellectuals who were groping toward a new social solution for Canadian problems, Bethune was a catalyst.
The fall of 1935, a group came together at Bethune's apartment. A dozen or two people, all with much the same concerns, found that Bethune was a focal point for their interest.
Let us abandon our isolation and grasp the realities of the present economic crisis. There is an underlying feeling medicine is now practiced in this country does not serve adequately either the patient or the physician. The contest in the world today is between two kinds of men. Those who believe in the old jungle individualism and those who believe in cooperative efforts for the securing of a better life for all.
Many people felt exactly the same thing in those days because there was evident injustice all about us, and a degree of incompetence in the society, waste. There was enough to shake almost anybody out of their shoes and make them want to do something. It became so evident that we were all involved in finding a solution because the whole society itself was extremely shaken, unstable. And you couldn't sit on the sidelines unless you lacked all sense of human relationships.
Let us present to the government a complete, comprehensive program of a planned medical service for all the people. The people are ready for socialized medicine.
So we devised a brief, a statement, and sent it out with a covering letter to every candidate for election. Well, several plans were proposed, and in the light of what's happened since, these are not radical.
Montreal was frightened in many ways. I think the business community was greatly frightened by the Depression and the inability to get business started and the radical new thoughts about business. Then the religious authorities were frightened through fear of communism and the attack upon the church that they felt communists represented. There was a general sense of fear in the established authorities, and in such a situation, one tends to get reactionary attitudes expressed in various ways.
Almost anybody who was as far to, perhaps to the left as John G. Diefenbaker at that time would have been considered a dangerous citizen.
If you will recall the 1930s, that portion of them, Hitler had mounted to power. In Montreal, there were evidences of anti-Jewish violence, Bethune looked on Nazism and fascism as a disease, very much like tuberculosis, as a kind of insanity, he said once.
Politics everywhere is being polarized to the extreme left and right wings. The world is emotional, verging on violence, and focused on Spain. It is 1936, and the democratic Spanish Republic has been invaded by the fascists of Francisco Franco.
Hemingway, who had no particular politics, expressed what millions of younger people said when he said, fascism has got to be licked sometime. The easiest and cheapest and best place to lick it is right there in Spain.
I think Bethune always felt that he was marked for big things. I think it wouldn't be wrong to say that he felt that he was a man of destiny.
He was always looking over your head, looking away. He was making his rounds on Ward B, but I think his mind was making rounds all over the world and wondering where to go next.
He said to me, George, I'm going to Spain for one very good reason among others. He said, it's in Spain that the real issues of our time are going to be fought out.
Bethune is in England looking for help. He finds a Canadian architect, Hazen Size.
Well, I remember it was a rainy Sunday in London, and I had a little studio in Chelsea, and I was spending a lazy day looking at some books I just bought, and Bethune came to my studio that night about 6 o'clock. The doorbell rang, and I opened it, and here was this ramrod erect man of medium height with a pork pie hat on and a military mustache and a trench coat, and he strode in and upstairs into my studio, and before I knew it, I was saying, my gosh, I'd like to go with you.
Together, they drive south through Paris and on into Spain.
The World War has started. It is democracy against fascism. I wouldn't be anywhere else. History is being made here. This is the hub of the universe.
Spaniard against Spaniard, and on each side brigade upon brigade of foreign fighting men. Nazi Germans, fascist Italians on the side of Franco, communists, socialists, liberals on the side of the Republic. Bethune is in Madrid, which he said would be the tomb of fascism.
We were heavily bombed today, about 12 noon. Standing in a doorway as these huge machines flew slowly overhead, each one heavily loaded with bombs, I glanced up and down the street. A hush fell over the city. It was a hunted animal, crouched down in the grass, quiet and apprehensive. There is no escape, so be still. Then in the dead silence of the streets, the songs of birds came startlingly clear in the bright winter air. If the building you happen to be in is hit, you will be killed or wounded. If it is not hit, you will not be killed or wounded. One place is really as good as another. After the bombs fall, and you can see them falling like great black pears, there is a thunderous roar. From heaps of huddled clothes on the cobblestones, blood begins to flow. These were once live women and children.
I don't know at what point it seemed clear to him that one thing that was very badly needed was an organized blood transfusion service. And I don't think there's any doubt that his decision was a correct one from the medical point of view, but I also suspect that he instinctively realized that the giving of blood had an enormous emotional punch to it. So it was really a very moving thing that morning. We looked out our window onto the Principe de Vergara and looked down from the little terrace that opened off our apartment, and there was this long lineup of people right around the corner of the block, and it was a really very exciting moment.
1,200 donors the first day. The Canadian blood transfusion unit is a reality. Bethune presses his vigorous public relations campaign.
A real snappy service can be set up. Special badges for donors, a star for each donation. It's a beautiful idea, isn't it? And Canadian.
He and his Canadians devise a workable system for the refrigeration and movement of blood in quantity.
How long can blood be kept? How long is it usable? No one knows exactly. We have an idea we can keep it very much longer than has yet been thought possible.
The wounded are dying, searching for blood. Now the blood can move. Now the blood can search out the wounded.
Succeeded in unifying all remaining Spanish transfusion units under us, serving 100 hospitals and clearing stations on a 1,000-kilometer front. It's the same as organizing a milk route.
In their faces, and they'd start paying attention. They'd possibly start cursing, and particularly the Spanish wounded would be always saying, "Mamma mia, mamma mia." But they became alive right under your eyes within the space of several minutes. It was really an extraordinary thing. He was always outpouring energy, although he was living on one lung and frequently almost collapsed. He was getting desperately tired, and he was on the raw edge of his nerves most of the time. We all used to drink a certain amount. I remember Bethune, of course, was a Sybarite. He loved good living, and he saw no contradiction between doing good work for humanity and also enjoying the pleasures of this world. I remember he said to us, now we've got the unit just beginning to tick. Christmas is coming. Let's pile into the car and go up to the Sierra de Guadarrama. I remember it was a lovely day, wonderfully keen, cold air. I still have a photograph of Bethune with his hands over his eyes, gazing down into the valley below towards the Escorial and Madrid and the mists in the distance there.
The breathing spells are short. Bethune on the southern coast, driving toward a flood of refugees, fleeing the advancing fascists along a Corniche road.
And then we began to run into this pathetic procession of people first little groups and then got thicker and thicker. It was just like a river of humanity driving against us. Whenever I drive here in Canada during a snowstorm with those snowflakes coming at you and at you and at you on the windshield, I'm always reminded of these people.
There will be no food to be found in the villages, no trains, no buses to transport them. They must walk, and as they walked, they staggered and stumbled with cut, bruised feet along the flint-white road. Imagine 150,000 men, women, and children. There's only one road they can take. We had passed so many that we thought it best to turn back and start transporting the worst cases to safety. It was difficult to choose which to take. Our car was besieged by a mob of frantic mothers and fathers who, with outstretched arms, held up to us their children, their eyes and faces swollen and congested by 4 days of sun and dust. Take this one. See, this child. This one is wounded. How could we choose between taking a child dying of dysentery or a mother silently watching us with great sunken eyes, carrying against her open breast her child born on the road 2 days ago? Many old people simply gave up the struggle, lay down by the side of the road, and waited for death. We first decided to take only children and mothers. Then the separation between fathers and children, husband and wife, became too cruel to bear. We carried 30 to 40 people a trip for the next 3 days and nights back to Almeria.
The exhausted refugees collapsed in the safety of Almeria. Now came what Bethune called the final barbarism.
After the planes had passed, I picked up in my arms 3 dead children from the pavement where they had been standing in a great queue, waiting for a cupful of preserved milk and a handful of dry bread. One's body felt as heavy as the dead themselves, but empty and hollow, and in one's brain burned a bright flame of hate. I can't write you, my friends, as I should like to write you, because my words are poor, anemic, and hobbling things. Uncomfortable, good God. What a word to describe the paralyzing fear that seizes one when a shell bursts with a great roar and crash nearby. Killed? For these poor huddled bodies of rags and blood lying in such strange shapes face down on the cobblestones, or with sightless eyes upturned to a cruel and indifferent sky. Lovely, when the sun falls on our numbed faces like a benediction. So you see, it's no good.
The Republican armies are beginning to strangle in jealousies, confusion, red tape. Bethune, the lone wolf, is in a mounting rage.
It was time he did leave, because the whole picture had changed. He had the temperament to operate in mobile, let us say, almost a guerrilla warfare situation, but not the temperament to operate in the rather tighter, disciplined army that was emerging in the spring and summer of 1937.
From the Queen Mary, Bethune looks out at the Atlantic. 2 years before, he had sailed this ocean to Russia. He had been deeply affected by communism then and had written of the Russian Revolution.
Is she not ugly? Yes. Is she not beautiful? Yes. Is she not pitiful, ludicrous, grotesque, and absurd? Yes. Is she not magnificent and sublime? Yes. Creation is not and never has been a genteel gesture. It is rude, violent, and revolutionary. I'm not as yet perfectly convinced that communism is the solution to the problem. The ironic and ludicrous picture of a half-hearted convert reluctantly being burned at the stake for his half-hearted, feeble convictions rises in my mind. I'm entirely in agreement with the ideology of this modern religion, but deeply disturbed with some of its aspects in practice.
Now, in the summer of 1937, Bethune decides to throw in with the Communist Party. However, Bethune the Marxist does not interfere with Bethune the happy wanderer.
He had just arrived in New York that morning, and he said, I'm at Longchamps. Hurry up, come on down. So I left the office and went to Longchamps, and here he was sitting up at the bar with a very handsome Hungarian named Geza Carpatha with great, huge black eyes and not one word of English, and a very pretty blonde girl with whom Beth was carrying on long and involved conversations. So he greeted me and kissed me and said hello, and then said, do you remember that hat you had, that straw hat with the ribbon down the back? I said, yes. He said, what happened to it? I said, it's at the hotel. Oh, well, come on, drink up, everybody. So they all have to down their drinks, the girl and Geza and I, and we get into a taxi and we go to the hotel and we go up in the elevator, all of us, and I get the hat down. Beth says, put it on, and I put it on, and he said, ah, that's nice.
Back to Canada, and Bethune is front page news. He barnstorms the country, raising money for Spain. In Toronto, the parade is a half-mile long.
I think he was an amateur in politics. I think he'd never had long experience of political life, obviously. He was guided by his heart as much as by his head. Maybe he was, after all, a surgeon. He was accustomed to cutting out the evil in the human body and throwing it away, and maybe something about the concept of a communist revolution was a sort of vast national surgery. Maybe something induced him to take to this more readily. I don't know.
I had hoped that he was happier and was less lonely. He seemed to be always surrounded by people. It was only later that I realized this had been really quite an unhappy and stormy time in his life.
Bethune is frustrated, craving action, and flat broke.
Of course, at that time, tremendous melancholy and disillusionment. I mean, he felt he was disappointed of a sin that he found here after Spain, you know. And the communists took him, but wanted to hold him in a disciplinary way, which you couldn't hold Bethune. So it's neither one thing nor another. And he felt that he cut his bridges from medicine and his great position and comforts and so on.
Norman came back from Spain knowing that things were washed up. And things were washed up, he believed, because of the same kind of apathy as had made the medical care problem for Montreal's unemployed. He saw that in China, a similar struggle was going on a much greater scale, and he identified himself with that.
His eyes are on China, invaded by Japanese warlords intent on the subjugation of the Orient.
At the time, you may remember, most of the democratic world was sending aid to Spain, medical aid, and China wasn't, no one thought of China. And he felt it was very important for him to go to China. He began speaking of China while he was in Spain.
In January 1938, Bethune arrives at the Chinese War. He began to move north and was befriended by the Canadian medical missionary, Dr. Richard Brown.
My first impression was very poor of him. I didn't know how I could get along with him. But I didn't change my opinion either. I thought he was pretty arrogant all the way through and could make a lot of enemies, particularly for the Orientals.
But Dr. Brown saw the possibilities in Bethune and agreed to guide him north.
We met some Catholic missionaries. They opened a bottle of red wine and gave me a good cigar. They said, I hope we meet again on earth. If not, then in heaven.
After 2 months and being given up for dead, they reached Yan'an.
We got there late in the afternoon, and I went immediately by invitation to see Mao Zedong, who at that time was the old chairman of the People's Committee, who was responsible for organizing guerrilla resistance and training. Dr. Bethune saw Mao Zedong, I think, the next day, and what they discussed, I don't know. He had great plans, and I think he hoped to save the Chinese army. What he wanted to do was to get to the front lines, and see if he couldn't get the wounded before they got in such bad condition.
In the shifting battle lines of a guerrilla war, to be wounded was generally to die. He began to gather his forces. Spain was just a beginning. He would move whole hospitals to the front.
The time has passed and gone in which doctors will wait for patients to come to them. Doctors must go to the wounded, and the earlier the better. We were able to construct a new form of transport for field hospital equipment to carry all necessary for an operating room, a dressing room, and a drug room. All this equipment, sufficient for 100 operations, 500 dressings, and making up 500 prescriptions, can be carried on 2 mules.
Carting a sleeping bag from Abercrombie & Fitch, Bethune moves into the hills.
It took, I think, 2.5 days to get to Sui Fu, and from there on it was all by foot, which again annoyed Bethune. We had to go through these deep passes and quite frequently unload the mules to get through, and Bethune couldn't quite see why they didn't widen. Now, what all these people, why don't they widen these roads or do something? I suggested to Bethune on several occasions he might leave some of his paraphernalia behind, his beds and his whatnot, but they always seem to get a place with the mules, too.
They come on the strange cave hospitals where the moribund are abandoned.
They're crawling with lice. They have only one uniform, and that they have on. Their bandages have been washed so often that now they are nothing but dirty rags. 3 men, one with the loss of both feet through frostbite gangrene, have no clothes at all to wear. Most of them are slowly dying of sepsis and starvation. Some moan gently and persistently to themselves. There is no morphine for their pain. And when I hurt them, as sometimes I must, they weep the hopeless, overwhelming tears of little children. We are traveling a road watered with tears and blood. I have operated all day and I'm tired. 10 cases, 5 of them very serious. A combination of shouts, tears, and smiles has worked wonders here. It's true I'm tired, but I don't think I've been so happy for a long time. I am content. I'm doing what I want to do. The partisans are a great people. It's a pleasure to work on them. After I dress their wounds, they rise and bow profoundly, with an inclination of the body from the waist. The father of the little boy knelt on the ground with his head at my feet to thank me.
Chinese love to call him occasionally as the tiger, but his official name was the White One Cent by Chuan. Most of the operations, I said, were done in peasant homes or temples. Of course, the whole village turned up to see it, crowding their noses into the window and gradually getting inside and being shooed out. And one day Bethune, suddenly without the blue, blood all over his apron and blood on his hands. He never wore gloves and a scalpel, so he chases them, you see, and these poor women and children screaming their heads out. They really thought the devil was after them.
Today is my birthday, my 48th. Last year in Madrid, this year in China. Walked in the town, black pigs with big floppy ears, barkless dogs. Dressed 6 wounded soldiers.
Bethune is now everywhere. While he works on the sick and wounded, a host of eyes watch his every move. He trains whole hospitals single-handed and from scratch. Instructions on 1,000 details pass through his interpreters to the bedpan orderly or to Mao Zedong. He tries to cope with the desperate shortage of supplies, and when he can't, he teaches the Chinese to improvise, to make their own medicines, to build their own equipment. In the moments between, he is writing back to Canadian newspapers with cries for aid, and to the Chinese telling them what they must do if that aid does not come. In 1 year, he had become a Chinese legend.
I've been too busy to do more. Traveled 300 miles last month, 113 operations. My life's pretty rough, and sometimes tough as well. It reminds me of my early days up in the northern bush. Oh, let me confess that on the first of the new year, I had an attack of homesickness. Memories of New York, Toronto, Montreal. If I were not so busy, I could find reasons enough for a holiday. My health is pretty fair. Teeth need attention. One ear has been completely deaf for 3 months. Glasses for eyes need correction. But apart from these minor things and being pretty thin, I'm okay. Books? Are books still written? Is music still being played? Do you dance, drink beer, look at pictures? What do clean sheets in a soft bed feel like? Do women still love to be loved? Lord, I wish we had a radio and a hamburger sandwich.
In 18 months, Bethune has aged 20 years. He is now operating largely in temples of the Buddha, the compassionate one.
The kerosene lamp overhead makes a steady buzzing sound like an incandescent hive of bees. Mud walls, mud floor, mud bed, white paper windows, smell of blood and chloroform, cold. September the 1st, 1939, North China, near Linchu. Men with wounds. Wounds like little dried pools, caked with black-brown earth. Wounds like torn edges frilled with black gangrene. Wounds expanding outward, decaying orchids or crushed carnations, terrible flowers of flesh. Careful. Better moisten first. Pick the leg up. Where's that fine, strong rod of bone now? In a dozen pieces. What fun it was. Now that is finished. Now that's done. Now we are destroyed. Now what will we do with ourselves? Next. What, an infant? 17. Shot through the belly. Keep him warm. How? Dip those bricks into hot water. And this one? Will he run along the road beside his mule at another harvest with cries of pleasure and happiness? No. That one will never run again. How can he run with one leg? No more. 6 o'clock in the morning. God, it's cold in this room. Open the door. Over the distant dark blue mountain, a pale, faint line of light appears in the east. In an hour, the sun will be up.
The well-equipped armies of Japan are pushing back the Chinese. Bethune is in daily danger of capture. His wounded are hidden at night in heaps of straw.
Our unit was situated 2 miles from the firing line. Operated on 115 cases in 69 hours, continuous work. 15 operations were performed without anesthetic as we ran out of chloroform.
He had planned a fundraising tour of Canada. There is not even a supply of rubber gloves. He cuts his finger while operating. Blood poisoning begins its spread through an already broken body. He is 49 years of age.
I am fatally ill. I'm going to die. My 2 cots are for you and Mrs. Ney. My 2 pairs of English shoes also go to you. I would like to give a blanket each to Shu, my attendant, and Chang, my cook. We need 250 pounds of quinine and 300 pounds of iron compounds each year. Never buy medicines in such cities as Baoting, Tianjin, or Peking again. The prices there are twice as much as in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Give my everlasting love to all my Canadian and American friends. Tell them I have been very happy. My only regret is that I shall now be unable to do more.
The generals pay homage, and Bethune's interpreter, Tong, spoke for them all.
I wish to tell you of our Doctor Bethune. He died on a night of many stars in the sky. He knew, we all knew, he would die. We wept. We carried his body, frail it had become, over many li over our mountains. Through our villages the people gathered. We said, "It is our Doctor Bethune." They wept. The heavens wept. We will build him a tomb in the hills.